Good evening, everyone. We continue our lesson as we study First Samuel chapter 8. We ended yesterday in verse 9. I like to just highlight one point from verse 9 as we carry on into verse 10. It is that God is warning them. So God tells Samuel to warn the people, and basically is to solemnly solemnly declare the I would say the consequences the consequences of their demand. And their request was for the king who will reign over them. And so God is actually engaging with the elders and is about to explain to them the procedure, the processes, the roles and responsibilities of the king, as well as to warn them of the consequences when the king comes into play. I would like us to think of it this way, that this basically shows us that God is just. When the time comes and when God judges them, God will be able to say, "No, I told you so." Kind of argument, so that they cannot say that I didn't know. God knows that they are not aware how a nation would react under a king. They just look at other nations. The goyim around them are having kings, except for Israel herself. And so God is being fair to them to make them understand. God is not stopping them, but God wants them to know that this is really a choice. And this choice that they make is freely made, such that they will bear the consequences, good or bad, as it comes down the road. Today we begin verse 10. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord. Understand the words, you've seen this before, the davar, usually found in the prophet books. As we begin every prophet book, the prophets would declare the word of the Lord. And so the whole idea here is about the davar, the issues, the matters, the problems. And so in this case, it would be the whole warning, I guess, and the procedures that is going to be declared to them. And so Samuel said all of these to the people who had asked of him a king. The whole the whole narrative now in chapter 8 revolves around the issue of asking for a king. Verse 11, Samuel said, "This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you." Now understand, this word reign is to be king, right? To be king, to take on the role of a king. And the word procedure, you really need to understand this, because it is the same word, mishpat, uh, judging. That is the same word. And essentially is to inform us that the king will take on the role that Samuel is doing, and of course, and more. And so this will be the judging, the judgment, the processes of the king, the Melech. And these are the warnings. So God warns them, when you have the king will be your Elohim. Remember that the king is now going to be their Elohim, the mighty one. And he will have the full authority over the nation. He will take your sons, and this would be literally the male children, and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. The idea here is they will serve the king as part of his army. And what does that mean? It means that they will fight. It also means that they can die. So be aware that the king will have the final decision as to where, who to fight. Verse 12, he will appoint for himself commanders. These are the chiefs, right? These are the chiefs, commanders. And they would be commanders of thousands, fifties, to do his plowing, to reap his harvest, to make his weapons of war, and to make equipment for his chariots. This would be the metalsmith, and will be making weapons of war. Chariots are also weapons of war, the vehicles of war. And the king will have land that will require plowing and harvest. It is to do as the king pleases. Then he goes on to say he will also take your daughters. This would be the female children for perfumers, cooks, and bakers. In Oriental time, women were not going to war. And so the men, the sons, will go to war, and the women, the daughters, will support the war vehicles to make perfumers. This would be perfume makers. And then they will cook and they will bake. Why perfume makers? And it appears that in those days people don't bathe very regularly, and so nice scents are used to cover over body odor, I suppose. But these are the roles of the daughters. And so what is Samuel saying is that when the king comes into play, he will decide what he wants to do for himself to serve him, and he will take your sons and daughters for these purposes. We now go to verse 14. Verse 14 says this: he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, your olive groves, and give them to his servants. Why would a king do that? A king would want the best for the army, because you have to feed the army and treat them well so that they will die for you in the battlefield. And so you would get the best, the best of your fields, your vineyard, your olive groves, and these will be the the things that God has promised them when they came into the promised land. And the best now goes to the king. Now watch verse 15. He will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and his servants. A tenth. This is something for us to just break down a little bit. A tenth is also translated as a tithe, a tenth part. And so what will this be? You would have the whole, And then you have the first fruits. And then you have the tithes for the Levites. These are all going to God. And what God is saying now with the king, they will also take your best, whatever is there, and also take another tenth. Now, the tenth is a very common denominator. The tenth is is frequently used for rewards, right? For rewards. And so giving a tenth to so and so, or taking a tenth of the booty, or giving a tenth to the Levites, they are all part and parcel of this Hebrew culture or the Semitic culture of taking a tenth as a symbol of reward. And this is going to the king, to his officers of war, and to his servants who will fight the war. Verse 16, he will also take your male servants, your female servants, and your best young men, your donkeys, and use them for his work. This is about the king's affairs, and these will be the work to be done. And so work done would be done by the servants, the donkeys. The donkeys is actually an animal of labor, an unclean animal, but particularly singled out for protection, for special consideration, because it helps them do work. And if you have a king, he can also take your male servants and your female servants to do his work. Now, this is important for them to realize that when the king comes into play, they will have less. Without a physical king, they have more, and nobody is to disturb them, because God doesn't need the servants, the male servants, the female servants, the donkeys, any more of their seed and the vineyards, any more the best of the fields, as long as God has the first fruits. That would be a reminder to them that this land belongs to God. And because of their obedience to God, God has given them rain and water so that they could have good harvest. And so that's the honoring to God. But once you have a king, there will be another layer of taxation. In verse 17, he says, he will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Look at what this means. Another tenth, right? That would be another reward, or if you like, it would be a tax, a reward for the king to do whatever the king needs, because the king will require money and food and assistance to mobilize for whatever the king needs. And so he takes another tax on your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants to listen to the king. And so now what we're going to have will be this pyramid scheme. Right here will be the king. And on top, here will be the people. Then you have God over all. And so once you have the king, there will be another layer to listen to. And that is what God is trying to explain to them. Do you know what you're asking for? Then you will cry out in that day because of your king. The idea here is the king that you have chosen for yourselves. You would cry out. Verse 18, when it says you will cry out, it means that you are going to call for help, cry for help. One day you will cry out for help because of the king whom you have chosen, and because you now realize that the king whom you have chosen is not quite what you had thought, right? Now, obviously, what God is trying to tell them is this: kings are humans, kings are like them. They are good ones, and on a good day, it will be great. But on a bad day, you've got a bad king, then you will be calling out for help. And look at what God is saying: the Lord will not answer you in that day. God will ignore your cry of help. Now, this would be very surprising when we read this, because we always think that God will always listen to people when they cry out to them, but not when they are choosing something which they now have clear understanding of what may possibly happen into the future. And God says, you will bear all the consequences, good and bad. The bad part would be when the time comes and you call for help, I won't be around. The good part would be when the king is good, you will prosper. And that would be the effect of having a human king. But if it was God, God will place judges around you, but God will watch what you do and bless the land. Now God will look at the king to execute judgment. What is important for us now to figure out is this: after listening to all these things, we have to understand that God is being fair with them, because they have never seen how one of them could be king and what can that look like. Now, the older generation who died in the wilderness had spent time in Egypt with Pharaoh. These people, when they entered into the promised land, being the young generation under 20 leaving Egypt, and also the generation that was born in the wilderness, none of them had ever had a king or had an encounter where a king was over them. They had only looked around them as they were conquering king after king, that they thought to themselves right now that the sons of Samuel wasn't that great after all. It's nothing to do with Samuel, but to find out that perhaps it is time that they had a human king. And in so doing, unknowingly rejected or spurned God, who was their king. And so they wanted somebody like every other nation around them. And so God told them, this is what's going to happen. The king will tax you. There will be an additional 10% at least that will go to the king for what the king needs to do, to feed his army, to feed his entourage. That's what a king will have. So the king can't just be king, and where is the money coming from? Where is the food coming from? Where is the land coming from? He will take all these from the people. And so when he taxes the people cannot deny him, because the king is the Lord over all the land. That is what God is trying to tell them. I am all over all you. I am your God. I'm your Elohim. Now they are having another Elohim. In this sense, a human king, not as a god in the idol worshiping, but literally a god in the sense of one who has authority over them. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, We read from verses 14 to 20 yesterday, and God gave the rules for the king. In the event that the people wanted to have a king, they are to be reminded, especially the king has to be reminded of what to do. Now, obviously, when it is a rule that is set in place, it is also a choice. Like this, having a king is a choice. And the king, whoever is chosen, also has a choice to listen to God or not listen to God. But to be fair to every party, before God will get angry with them, before God will execute judgment in due time, God lets them know the score, lets them know what is going to happen, lets them know what the king is supposed to do, lets them know what the people will suffer under a king. That is to show us that God is just. Now, I've been saying this over and over again because we seldom, if ever, think of God as just. But throughout the theme of the Hebrew scriptures, we always see that God is just. He is a just God. And that phrase, that description, that characteristic of God resounds right across the Hebrew scripture. Now, we have always thought of God as God is love. But did you know that God is love is not a description of the Hebrew scripture? God is just is all over the scripture. Why? Because God is describing himself in a character where he will be fair to the people. He will be fair to them if they have made a choice. There are consequences, and God will execute fairly when he will say that I will not hear you because I have told you so. So bear with the consequences and pay the price of your choices. And that is how God has been described right through scripture in the historical narratives, in the Psalms, in the wisdom books, in the prophet books. You would find that God is just. He is a just God, and that keeps repeating itself. Right here, God is just to let them know ahead of time what may happen, especially when you do not have a good king. And so don't cry out for help when the time comes. Of course, everybody assumes that you have a good king. And if the king listens to God's instructions of Deuteronomy chapter 17, that will be just fine. But God knows. And we should now, as we look back into the historical narrative, that the king listening to God in Deuteronomy 17 is a choice. And now that we have seen many of the kings, especially the northern kings, they did not obey God. And hence, there were bad kings, and bad kings will oppress the people. Bad kings will implement programs and policies where the people will suffer. Verse 18 basically nets out everything to the people to demonstrate that God is just. I hope that this will be kept at the back of our minds when we go through the rest of the Bible itself. Verse 19, after the long and short of what Samuel had said. In verse 19, the people refused. And this word refused means utterly refused. The picture that's given to us is, how should we say, is that they have made up their mind before they met up with Samuel. This is a reaction of a fixed mind. This is not an open mind, because they did not consider everything God had said. And you can tell that when a person has fixed up his mind, it doesn't matter all the good advice that you give them, they will say no. They will just be stubborn to follow their own desires. And that is exactly what happened. The people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. Listen here is to hear. Let me just break this down. It is to hear. Hear would be to pick up the sounds or the voice of Samuel, to understand, contemplate, and then act accordingly. Now, with this, you find that in the English Bible, there is a tendency to translate this word here to obey. And naturally so, because this word here carries the connotation that one has to listen to what Samuel has to say, understand what Samuel has to say, think through what Samuel has said, and then make decisions and act accordingly to what was said. Recall, I used to give you this example when a parent tells a child, son, pick up your toys. Don't leave it on the floor, because somebody would step on it and will slip and fall, and that would be a terrible thing. And so the command is to tell them to pick up the toys. Now, the son would then look at the mother and then goes back to playing his computer game or watching TV. And the mother would then say, did you not hear me? And so note the word hear. Did you not hear me? And if the son says, yes, mommy, I heard you, and continues to play, the mother would then ask, didn't you hear what I just said? And he says, yes, I hear you, mommy. And then the mother says, why don't you go and pick up the toys? He says, mommy, you only want me to hear your voice, and I heard you loud and clear. How do you think the mother would feel? Now, this is exactly what God has done to express the justice of God to the people, and through Samuel, expected them to hear and listen to the voice of Samuel, but they refused. Refused means they will reject everything that Samuel had said, because they haven't really done any of these things. They don't want to listen to Samuel. Basically, the picture that's given to us is that these people have already made up their mind, regardless of what Samuel would have to say. And so look at the rest of verse 19. And they said, no, there shall be a king over us. That is what they want. They want a king. That we also may be like all the nations, all the people around us, the Goyim, all of them around us that are non-Israel, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And so this is what they are saying. Our king to judge us. So instead of Samuel and the rest of the judges, Samuel can go into retirement to go before us, instead of God bringing the ark ahead of the people. The king would go and fight to give leadership to the people instead of God, and then to fight our battles. In those days, the king doesn't sit at home in the palace and shake leg and wait for things to happen. In the ancient warfare, the king actually is present at the field, and the king is actually a good fighter. And so that's what they are thinking, that our king will settle our disputes. The king will be bold to go ahead of us. The king will be bold and victorious. That's basically what they are saying. We don't need you, Samuel. We hear you, but we don't need you. We are looking at a king, and we are no longer looking at God. And so when God gave Deuteronomy 17, it is with the expectation that the rules of God and the rules of engagement, the rules of justice, the rules of freedom, the rules of truthfulness is all in the person embodied by the king, because he is the one who would learn the Torah of God, listen to the commands and statutes of God, and to execute before God. Thereby, the people can be assured that they will have a king who can truly represent the character of God within the nation. And so that is what the people is asking for, but the people know not what they ask. Understand that this was a warning. The warning that the dread of the king shall be upon them. Means this: if you go back and read Genesis chapter 9, verse 2, after the flood, God told Noah that I've given you all living things as food, and the dread of you shall be upon them. The animals will be fearful of the humankind because they will catch them and eat them and kill them. Now, before that, or before the flood, there was no such thing. The animals were never afraid of man. And that's how we would read that verse. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, the warning of God was to tell them that the dread of the king that would tax them, take the sons and daughters, the male servants, female servants, the best of the harvest, the vine, and all these things, the king will be doing that. And this is to tell them the dread of the king shall be upon the people, and the people shall be servants of the king. And the reaction of the people should be like the animals, because the king has the authority to take your sons and daughters and to judge anyone to take their lives or to allow them to live. That is so powerful a king, and that's why the word Elohim is ascribed to the king. And the king is an embodiment of God on this land. And that is how they envision the king to be. But God gave provisions of Deuteronomy 17 to safeguard the sanctity of the Torah amongst the people. In the last two verses of this chapter, now after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, this, I guess, is something that we again understand. Heard means to listen carefully. And all the words, the word words here is also davar. God gave his davar, the people gave their davar. And so this word here, repeated them in the Lord's hearing. Literally is translated, how should we say it? repeated them. He spoke them. I guess we could say he spoke them. He I think we can say he spoke them into the ears of the Lord, right? Being Jehovah. So the word repeated may not be something that I would use, but the translator has decided because he had heard, and then he would take everything he has heard and to say it to God's hearing. And so that would be the English word of repeat. But literally, it literally says this, and Samuel spoke the words that the people had said into the ears of the Lord. And so the focus of the Hebrew is in the action. The focus of the English translation is in the concept, and thereby gives us a slightly different view of how the narrative is described. Our final verse for today, the Lord said to Samuel, the decision was this: listen to their voice, appoint them a king. The word appoint them a king is really to cause let's see, the word is to cause one to be king, right? Appoint them a king is to cause one to be king. And so God says, listen to them. It's okay. Since they have heard it, they have made up their minds, they should be responsible. They are adults. They can deal with the consequences and they have to live with the consequences. Meaning this, if you want to, well, the Chinese say, right, if you eat salted fish, you must bear the thirst that it causes. Um, and and here God is saying, well, if you choose yourself a king and you want a king, well, you have to bear the consequences of having a king. And so, in conclusion of chapter 8, Samuel said to the men of Israel, okay, go back to your towns. Go home. Go home. It will be so. That would be the final concept as it is expressed in verse 22 of chapter 8. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.